What does a British general do when his finest legion is crushed, his pride wounded, and his campaign thrown into chaos? The aftermath of a single battle can set in motion a chain of events that alters the destiny of nations. Today, we're tracing the desperate pursuit and the brutal, pivotal clash that followed one of the American Revolution's most stunning victories. This is the story of the revenge that failed. First, be sure to like and subscribe to WinLink Deep Dive to support our investigative community. As January 17, 1781 drew to a close, the notorious Banastric Tarleton's command was largely captured or wiped out. With the handful of men who evaded the Americans, Tarleton raced back to his commander, Lord Charles Cornwallis. The American commander, Daniel Morgan, understood that news of this defeat would force Cornwallis to act swiftly to recover the prisoners and exact retribution. Therefore, Morgan paroled several British officers and gave the militia under Andrew Pickens the task of caring for the wounded and burying the dead. Once the battlefield was secure, Morgan immediately moved north with his 1,200 men, making camp on the eastern bank of the Broad River by nightfall. Simultaneously, Tarleton was delivering his report to Cornwallis. Legend states that upon hearing the news, the general drove the point of his sword into the earth and leaned heavily on the hilt until the blade snapped. As British prisoners began to trickle into Charleston, their contempt for Tarleton was clear. One redcoat was heard declaring in town that this was the inevitable result of giving such a command to a boy like Tarleton. Distraught, Cornwallis acted exactly as Morgan had predicted. He went in pursuit of the Americans. Cornwallis dispatched Tarleton to the western side of the Broad River to determine if Morgan remained near the site of the recent fighting. By that time, however, Morgan had already reached the Catawba River. Cornwallis moved north, staying just east of the Broad River. In his zeal to catch Morgan and Nathanael Greene, Cornwallis made the drastic decision to abandon a large portion of his baggage train, leaving behind camp followers. When the Redcoats crossed the border into North Carolina, it marked the final time they or their commander would ever see South Carolina. Hoping to confront them at the Catawba River, Morgan, after receiving reinforcements, began posting guards and obstructing the river's fords to force Cornwallis to meet him at a fortified position of his choosing. The loss of his light infantry at Cowpens made the march to intercept Morgan a miserable ordeal. The region's red clay turned the roads into quagmires, and the slow-moving heavy infantry suffered immensely from a lack of food. Their situation worsened when Cornwallis commanded that the remaining baggage train be set ablaze. The only wagons spared were those carrying medical supplies, salt and ammunition, along with 4 empty wagons for the sick and wounded. Cornwallis led by example, burning his own personal baggage, and his officers followed his lead. Charles O'Hara described their predicament in a letter to the Duke of Grafton, writing, "In this situation, without baggage, necessaries, or provisions of any sort for officer or soldier, in the most barren, inhospitable, unhealthy part of North America, opposed to the most savage, inveterate, perfidious, cruel enemy, with zeal and with bayonets only, it was resolved to follow Greene's army to the end of the world." On January 30th, General Nathanael Greene arrived to assume command of the American forces and strengthen the army. To further cripple Cornwallis's advance by drawing the Redcoats away from their supply bases in South Carolina and moving closer to his own reinforcements, Greene and his army made a frantic dash for the Dan River, with the British in hot pursuit. The Americans successfully crossed the Dan on February 14th. Unwilling to venture too far from South Carolina, Cornwallis turned his army south. This was Greene's cue to go on the offensive and harass the weakened British force. Greene aimed to lure Cornwallis into a full-scale battle and defeat the British in a fashion similar to Morgan's victory at Cowpens. He even employed a comparable strategy, forming 3 battle lines for a defense in depth to grind down the British assault. The American forces numbered approximately 4,400 troops. He positioned the North Carolina militia in the first line, supported on the left by Light Horse Harry Lee's Legion of Cavalry and Infantry and William Campbell's Virginia Infantry. The right was supported by some veterans from Delaware under Kirkwood and William Washington's Dragoons. The Virginia militia formed the second line, and he held the Continental troops in reserve for the third line. On the road that bisected the first battle line, he stationed 2 artillery pieces. Greene also placed 2 cannons with the Continental troops. However, a major difference existed between the battle lines of Morgan and Greene. Morgan had positioned his lines within sight of each other. Greene's lines were separated by hundreds of yards, with patches of forest between them. Cornwallis commanded roughly 2,000 troops. He arranged the Jaegers and the 33rd and 23rd Light Infantry on his left, supported by the Grenadiers and the 2nd Battalion of the Guards. On the right, the 71st Highlanders, who had narrowly escaped with Tarleton from Cowpens, and a German regiment made up the first line, supported by the 1st Battalion of Guards. Between these 2 wings, Captain Alexander McLeod commanded 2 3-pound cannons. Tarleton and his dragoons were held in reserve, waiting for a rout to occur. In that event, he would use his cavalry to chase down the fleeing enemy. Earlier on March 15th, Tarleton had skirmished with Lee and had been repulsed. As the British formed their battle lines, the American artillery under Captain Singleton began firing upon them. Though it caused little damage, Cornwallis ordered his army to advance. When the enemy closed to about 150 yards, the militia unleashed a volley. The British, however, did not halt. They continued their advance with fixed bayonets. A portion of the militia managed to fire a second volley. The Americans' aim was true and inflicted a heavy toll on the advancing British ranks. When the redcoats finally reached the militia, the American line collapsed almost instantly. The situation worsened for the Americans when the retreating militia from the first line did not rally at the second line but continued their flight to the rear. Consequently, the second line did not gain their numbers. The men from Delaware, however, did stop and joined the second line. On the American right, Lee and Campbell held their position, and as the Germans and Highlanders advanced past them, the Americans opened a punishing enfilading fire on their flank. This forced the 71st and the Germans to turn and attack Lee's legion. The 1st Battalion of Guards was dispatched to aid them and succeeded in driving Lee to the east. The 71st Highlanders then disengaged and moved to rejoin the main British force. The 2nd American line held firm, especially on its left flank, but its right flank began to drift backward toward the center. This maneuver allowed the British 33rd Regiment and the Jaegers to push past the second line and advance toward the Continentals. A vicious fight ensued, and a counterattack by the Continentals drove the Redcoats back, but Greene did not press the advantage. The second line eventually broke, and those militia also fled to the rear. Kirkwood's Delaware men and Washington's dragoons fell back to the third line. A point of historical debate exists. Did Kirkwood and Washington position themselves on the left or the right of the Continentals? For the purpose of this narrative, we will place them on the left of the Continental line. The British now moved to engage this third and final line. The Maryland and Virginia regulars waged a fierce fight against Cornwallis's assault. Washington and Kirkwood spotted a lull and an opening that appeared in the British line. They launched an attack, and though it was a courageous move, it failed to force the British into a significant retreat. Fearing his forces were in jeopardy, Cornwallis made a drastic decision and ordered his artillery to fire grapeshot directly into the melee, hitting both his own men and the Americans. The Continentals managed to hold off the British long enough for Greene's army to organize a retreat. To the south, Lee disengaged from his separate battle with the 2nd Battalion and the Germans, leaving Campbell to be attacked and driven from the field by Tarleton. American casualties were significant, 261 killed and wounded from the Continentals. An additional 361 were killed, wounded, or missing from the Virginia militia, and 562 were killed, wounded, or missing from the North Carolina militia. Of the militia casualties, 91%, or 846 men, were listed as missing. Cornwallis began the battle with just over 2,000 troops and lost approximately 515, over a quarter of his veteran regulars. His army was exhausted, starving, and in desperate need of supplies. Cornwallis would lead his battered force to Wilmington and ultimately to Yorktown, where he would be besieged and captured by the combined forces of George Washington and Rochambeau. And so, a battle that was technically a British victory ultimately crippled their ability to hold the Carolinas, setting the stage for the final act at Yorktown. Sometimes winning a battle can cost you the war. If you appreciate these deep dives into the pivotal moments of history, help us bring you more by hitting that like button and make sure to subscribe to the channel. Thank you for watching.